In the crystalline halls of Zephyria Prime, where the elite of the galaxy gathered in their shimmering splendor, a human janitor named Marcus Chon moved like a ghost. His weathered hands guided a floor buffer across pristine surfaces, while alien nobility laughed at his expense. They saw only a primitive creature, a third-class citizen worthy of nothing but their contempt. Little did they know the truth hidden beneath his humble exterior. The celestial palace rose like a fever dream. Against the aurora-painted skies, its amber corridors alive with bioluminescent veins, it pulsed in harmony with the planet's quantum heartbeat. Within these hallowed halls, where the privileged few determined the fate of billions, Marcus worked in silence. His worn uniform absorbed both sweat and insults with equal efficiency as he navigated between the crystalline beings who regarded humans as little more than clever pets. Look at the primitive creature. Lady Vexieria would laugh, her crystalline form fracturing light into painful rainbows as courtiers trailed behind her like living jewels. Still trying to make these floors clean enough for civilized beings. Each day, Marcus endured their mockery with the patience of a man carrying a burden far heavier than their words. Their laughter washed over him like waves against stone meaningless noise compared to the weight he carried. For Marcus had a purpose that transcended their petty games. A sick daughter named Sarah, who needed experimental treatment that cost more credits than most beings saw in lifetimes. The nobles glided through their existence on currents of privilege, their bodies sometimes literally translucent with status, never understanding how a being could labor with such quiet perseverance. When Count Theron, with his 6 jeweled arms and carapace that caught light like living fire, suggested teaching Marcus proper technique, our humble hero dared to speak. "I understand my job," he said simply. "I clean. You make messes." It's a simple arrangement. The temperature in the hall dropped so suddenly that breath crystallized in the air. How dare this human address nobility as an equal? The outsider's eyes, belonging to a small figure observing from the shadows, shimmered faintly, as if holding a truth older than the stars themselves. They couldn't leave such insolence unchallenged. So they orchestrated a public humiliation, calling Marcus to the grand atrium, where hundreds of courtiers gathered with holographic recorders broadcasting galaxy-wide. Lady Vexaria, her crystalline form glittering with malice that sent fractured light dancing across the walls, announced, "Today we address a matter of propriety." Our human employee seems to have forgotten the natural order. Marcus emerged, pushing his cleaning cart, the crowd parting like quantum waves around a solid object. Their whispers created ripples of disdain that nearly manifested as visible energy in the atmosphere-controlled chamber. Marcus Chun, Earthborn, third-class citizen, she continued with a blade-sharp smile that could have cut through starship hull plating. "What gives you the right to speak as an equal to those who control the very atoms beneath your feet?" "I don't claim to be your equal," Marcus replied quietly, his voice somehow carrying to every corner of the massive atrium without raising in volume. "I claim only the right to work with dignity." What they intended as execution by humiliation would instead become revelation. For Marcus accepted their challenge, the ancient trials of understanding that no human had ever attempted, much less passed. As the hall of trials materialized around them, with its blue pulsing light and ancient symbols that seemed to shift and change when viewed from different angles, none suspected that the floor beneath their feet was about to shift in ways no one could have imagined. The first trial was historical wisdom. Artifacts from across the galaxy's past appeared in hovering displays, each one a test that the nobles were certain would expose this human's primitive intellect. A broken sword of crystallized time, its edges constantly phasing between states of existence. A Voron Datakori, pulsing with the dying light of a civilization that chose extinction over assimilation. A flower preserved in quantum amber, its petals frozen in a state of both life and death simultaneously. A child's toy, so ordinary it seemed out of place among cosmic relics, All expected Marcus to fail spectacularly. Instead, he approached each artifact with reverence, studying them not as objects, but as stories embodied in matter. The sword was forged during the temporal wars, he said, his fingers hovering just above its unstable surface, broken because time itself rejected its existence. The data core contains the Voron cultural archives. They chose extinction rather than lose their soul to machines. As he spoke, the artifacts seemed to respond, glowing more brightly, as if recognizing a kindred spirit who understood their significance beyond mere historical facts. The flowers from Kepler's Garden Memorial Grove for Children, lost in the refugee crisis, he continued, his voice softening. And the toy belonged to Princess Lyra. Her death inspired the Corvash doctrine, protecting refugees galaxy-wide. The silence that followed was deafening. These weren't just correct answers. They revealed knowledge no janitor should possess. More disturbing still was the emotional resonance in his explanations, connecting each artifact not just to events, but to the moral principles that shaped galactic society. The second trial presented an impossible scenario: a dying space station with limited resources, life support failing, and 1,000 refugees aboard. The traditional solution required choosing who deserved to live and who should be sacrificed for the greater good. Rather than engaging with this grim calculus, Marcus smiled. The scenario assumed scarcity that doesn't exist, he explained, his hands moving through the holographic display, rearranging systems with the confidence of an engineer. 1,000 people aren't a burden. They're a resource. As the nobles watched in growing disbelief, Marcus outlined a solution involving rotating crews, sustainable micro-communities, and repurposing systems that the scenario designers had never considered. His solution involved everyone surviving, not through magical thinking, but through practical wisdom that recognized the value in every life. Murmuring from the crowd carried different tones now. This wasn't primitive thinking, this was wisdom they themselves had forgotten in their pursuit of technological supremacy and social stratification. But the final trial would shatter their reality completely. A neural interface activated, projecting images directly into minds, revealing how each observer interpreted what they saw. When shown a barren, war-scarred world, the nobles saw only destruction and failure, a civilization that had destroyed itself through primitive violence. Marcus saw something entirely different. It's not dead, he said softly. It's healing. The toxins aren't random pollutants, but biological markers. This species sacrificed their present to save their future, turning their planet into a processor to remove something far worse than die. War. When shown a paradise of perfect crystal cities in perfect harmony, the nobles saw the pinnacle of achievement. Marcus saw stagnation. They're dying, he said quietly, surprising everyone. Too perfect, too synchronized. They've achieved harmony by abandoning everything that makes evolution possible. No growth, no adaptation, no mistakes. Lady Vexaria stepped forward, her crystalline form vibrating with anger that sent harmonic resonances through the chamber. "Show us what you see when you look at us," she demanded. The neural interface amplified reality, and the nobles gasped as they saw themselves through Marcus's eyes, not as superior beings, but as beautiful but insulated creatures who'd grown so comfortable they'd forgotten what struggle meant. Not hatred in his perception, but genuine sadness for what they'd become. "You see us as objects of pity." Count Theron trembled, his multiple arms crossing defensively. "I see people who've never discovered who they really are when everything is taken away," Marcus replied gently. "Worth isn't measured by power or position. It's measured by what you do when no one's watching." But the interface revealed deeper memories, images no janitor should possess. Command bridges during the Void War, where living darkness threatened to consume all light in the universe. Diplomatic chambers where decisions affecting trillions were made with the stroke of a stylus. Research facilities where weapons capable of sterilizing entire star. Systems were developed to fight an enemy that could not be reasoned with. A younger Marcus wearing the elite insignia of the Galactic Council, not as a servant, but as a commander. Admiral Marcus Chun. Minister Kushtai breathed in shock, her serpentine form coiling tightly in the universal gesture of profound surprise. The ghost of the Outer Rim, the legend who had held the line at Nexus Point when all seemed lost. The tactician whose impossible maneuvers had turned the tide against the darkness. The hero who had disappeared 20 years ago, after the Battle of the Screaming Dark, presumed dead with honors. You died, Count Thurin said hollowly. No bodies, Marcus corrected. Because some of us learned what was worth living for. The interface revealed the horrifying truth creatures of living darkness consuming worlds, reality itself warping around their non-Euclidean forms. And Marcus, standing on the command bridge, receiving the impossible order and passing it along, sterilized 13 invaded worlds. 40 billion lives sacrificed to save galactic civilization. I gave the order, Marcus said, each word carved from stone. Pulled the trigger that murdered 13 worlds. When it was over, I realized I couldn't live being the kind of person who could make that choice and sleep at night. The gathered nobles stood transfixed, seeing not just the act, but feeling the weight of it through the neural interface, the crushing responsibility, the knowledge that every alternative led to worse outcomes, the moral injury that no medal or promotion could heal. So you abandoned your post, someone whispered. I stayed for the victory parades, Marcus said, his eyes distant. Watched politicians turn mass murder into noble sacrifice. The galaxy didn't need heroes who could kill 40 billion. It needed people who could find better ways. So he had disappeared, abandoning medals and parades, choosing instead to live for something other than duty. To learn what it meant to help in small ways instead of destroying in large ones. But your daughter, Lady Vexaria said, confused. The medical treatments ... Marcus smiled warmly. Sarah isn't my biological daughter. She's the child of friends who died after the war. I adopted her because she needed a father and I needed to learn how to build rather than destroy. But the most profound revelation was yet to come. From the shadows stepped a small figure with blue-tinted skin and oversized eyes, one of the nearly extinct ethereal wanderers. The child's movements carried a grace that seemed almost impossible in the planet's gravity, each step flowing like water, finding its natural course. The courtiers barely noticed until the child's bearing commanded attention, not through power, but through a presence that seemed to bend light itself toward them. Marcus turned, his composed facade finally faltering as recognition flickered in his eyes, followed by a pain so profound that several empathic nobles physically recoiled from the emotional impact. You remember me, the child said, their voice carrying ethereal harmonic resonance that made the palace walls themselves vibrate in sympathetic response. Through the neural interface, memory erupted not just images, but sensations, emotions. The very fabric of experience itself lay bare for all to witness. The 13th world, an evacuation ship failing as the void closed in. 3,000 refugees, including this small ethereal child, whose parents had already been consumed. The countdown timer showing 2 minutes. Marcus watching the ship's signal fade, giving the order that reduced the star system to #, but somehow, impossibly, this child had survived in a stasis pod protected by ethereal technologies that defied physics itself. And Marcus had found them, pulled them personally from the quantum wreckage, stayed by their side through 3 months of recovery, reading stories from a dozen worlds to help them process trauma that had no name in any language. The neural interface showed Marcus visiting the child in the recovery ward every day, learning fragments of ethereal lore and singing ancient songs and frequencies that human vocal cords weren't designed to produce, all to help this small survivor remember that beauty still existed in a universe that had shown them ultimate darkness. "I never knew your real name," the child said, their voice carrying harmonics that made the palace walls themselves resonate with sympathetic vibrations. "The medical staff called you Admiral, but when you thought no one was listening, you introduced yourself differently. You said your name was Friend," Marcus whispered, the word barely audible above the palace's ambient humming. The child smiled with heartbreaking gentleness that seemed to illuminate the entire hall with something warmer than light. "And then the war ended, and you disappeared from galactic history like you'd never existed. I never saw you again until today, when I recognized your soul through all the years, and pain and guilt you've carried, like armor against a universe that demands too much from those strong enough to bear it." The nobles learned that this child was one of exactly 3 survivors from the 40 billion souls, lost saved by technologies powered by love and desperation and the absolute refusal to let darkness have the final word. For 20 years, they had searched for the man who stayed with them when they had nothing left. "I came to Zephyriah Prime because I heard whispers and rumors," the child explained, turning to address the assembled crowd with an authority that made several ambassadors step backward involuntarily. "Stories of a human janitor who worked with impossible dedication, who saved every credit for a sick child, who wasn't even his own blood, who endured mockery and disrespect without complaint or retaliation." Their eyes, containing depths that seemed to stretch back to the beginning of time itself, returned to Marcus. "And somewhere in my heart, where hope lives even when logic says it shouldn't, I hoped it might be him." Count Theron's multiple arms fell to his sides in complete defeat. "All this time, you've been here among us, and we treated you like ... double quotes, like what you saw," Marcus finished gently, his voice carrying no trace of bitterness or recrimination. "A janitor, someone whose worth you measured by his position in your hierarchy, rather than his character or his contributions." He looked around the hall, his gaze touching each noble in turn with something that was neither judgment nor forgiveness, but simple recognition of a shared reality. "And you know what? You weren't wrong. I am a janitor. I clean up messes. I work for credits. I go home tired every night to worry about bills and medical expenses and weather. I'm doing enough for the people who depend on me." His voice grew stronger, not with anger, but with certainty. "But I chose that life because I learned something in the war that all your power and privilege has never been able to teach you. True strength isn't in the ability to destroy worlds, or command fleets, or reshape reality according to your will. It's in the choice to build something better, one small act at a time." The child reached up and took Marcus's weathered hand in theirs, their small fingers intertwining with his in a gesture that somehow encompassed all the love and loss and redemption that had brought them to this moment. "In our language, there's a word that doesn't translate well into galactic standard," they said, their voice carrying harmonics that seemed to make the very air shimmer with meaning. "Kithai Morai. It means one who builds light in the darkness. The humans would call it hero, but that's not quite right, because a hero fights against darkness. A Kithai Morai creates something so beautiful, so fundamentally good, that darkness simply can't survive in its presence." They looked up at Marcus with eyes full of absolute trust and love that had been tested by the worst the universe could offer and emerged stronger for the testing. "That's what you've been all these years through all your guilt and pain and self-imposed exile. Not the admiral who made impossible choices that saved the galaxy, but the friend who stayed with a frightened child when they had nothing left to believe in." 6 months later, the celestial palace of Zephyriah Prime had undergone a transformation that went far deeper than architecture or decoration. The same crystalline corridors still stretched toward infinity, but now they were traveled by beings from all strata of society, their voices mingling in a harmonic chaos that somehow produced something more beautiful than the previous sterile order. Marcus's cleaning cart sat in a place of honor in the palace's new Museum of Forgotten Wisdom, its humble form surrounded by artifacts from across the galaxy. Each exhibit represented someone whose worth had been overlooked, whose contributions had been dismissed, whose value had been measured by all the wrong criteria. The Chon Foundation for Interspecies understanding had grown beyond anyone's expectations, funded not just by voluntary contributions, but by a fundamental restructuring of how galactic society allocated resources. Where once wealth had flowed upward to those already drowning in excess, now it circulated through systems designed to recognize and elevate unacknowledged wisdom. Lady Vexaria, now serving as the Foundation's Director of Cultural Integration, had discovered talents she'd never known she possessed. Her crystalline form, once used primarily to reflect status and fashion, now glowed with purpose as she built bridges between beings who had never imagined they could communicate, let alone collaborate. The most profound lesson we've learned, she told a gathering of interplanetary ambassadors, is that intelligence and wisdom are not the same thing. We had accumulated vast knowledge, developed incredible technologies, achieved mastery over forces that reshape reality itself. But we had forgotten how to see the sacred in the ordinary, the profound in the simple, the heroic in the humble. Count Thurin had perhaps undergone the most dramatic transformation of all. His 6 arms, once used primarily for grand gestures of superiority, now worked alongside Foundation students in the palace's expanded research laboratories. He discovered that his mathematical gifts, when combined with insights from beings who understood systems from the ground up, could solve problems that had puzzled academics for centuries. We spent so much time looking up at the stars, he reflected during a joint project with former sanitation workers, that we forgot to notice the miracles happening right beneath our feet every single day.